Let me know when everyone is in. Let's see. We ready? I think so. Isabel, Julie, Diane may get extra points. Remember, it's St. Patrick's Day and wearing green. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. It's an easy day for me to remember. I guess today, 20 years ago today, I met my wife, of all things. So on St. Patrick's Day. So I will always remember St. Patrick's Day. Michelle, do we have
yes, everyone's here.
Okay, great. We're good morning again. So we're on YouTube, so welcome all our YouTube followers and anyone who watches the board meeting on recording after the fact. And good morning, board members, TAs, staff, observers. It's great to have you back. And we're gonna. It feels like it was only like 20 minutes ago that we got off the call. I'm sure that's how Kai and Bev and Nikki feel as well. But really important that we continue to make progress through this draft. We have the whole 3-hour session this morning going through. I hope that actually we make more rapid progress through the draft today, now that sort of the philosophical discussions and broader discussions have occurred. And I thought it was really important to have an open and honest discussion yesterday about the direction of the project. But today I'm hoping that we actually focus on the words of the paper and provide the task force some good feedback so they could keep the project moving. Kai, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning to you all for joining in again for another session of the LCE standard. I'll just start by a few comments about yesterday. As I said, yesterday we got your feedback and direction both on the general direction of the project, but also then on the scope and applicability. We will take the input that we got from you yesterday with us as a task force and consider it, and then consider how we can solve the issues that you brought up. So I think also, as Tom outlined for today's discussion, we're really going into the core of the standard, into the details of each different part. So I think when we go through that, we need to focus on, let's say, if we got the scoping right, what are actually the requirements that are there, so that we don't go into the scoping discussion again. I think we need to just assume that we will get there and scope out the complex areas. So assuming, so we get the feedback on actually how we can progress each and every part of the standard. So we need constructive feedback on if there are things that are missing or wrong, how we can solve it as well. So I'm looking forward for your feedback on the different parts as we progress today. Depending on how the time we use on the different parts, we may jump between some areas because we think there are certain parts that are maybe more where we need more direction in order to progress. And for the others, it's not that we don't want your comments, but then if we don't have time to do it now, then we may jump ahead, and then that we will get your comments written, and the written comments we would like to get early next week if we don't be able to get them on the meeting this week. So I think by that introduction, we probably should then jump straight into part 1, which covers the fundamental concepts and general principles. It is a part that's in the standard. We're trying to cover off the parts that are overarching, covering overarching concepts for the rest of the standards. In there, you can also see part 1, 2 around definitions, where we try to combine or include the definitions in the standard without duplicating it in the standard. So we want your feedback on that as well. I think the alternative, if we're not, if we don't agree on the approach that we've taken on definitions, would be to have it as a supplement to the standard, or have it as an appendix. Yeah, I think by that we probably should then open for comments on part 1, Tom.
Okay, part 1, which is pages 9 through I think 13 of the draft. Any comments on the fundamental concepts? Josephine.
Morning, everybody. Okay, so just a quick one on the preface, and I know we're on part 1, but this is a very easy one. I think in the issues paper, it was suggested that preface won't be included in the standard, but having read through the preface, I think that probably does need to be included in the standard. And so perhaps that's just a misunderstanding of what was in the issues paper, but just something to ask, really. On part 1, one of the things that I picked up, which I don't have a particular issue with generally, that relevant ethical requirements are always valid in an LCE audit, of course they are. But I do think that this actually needs to be a requirement. I don't think it's appropriate just to make an assumption. And, you know, even having a quick glance at the LCE standard that the Indian Chartered Accountants have put out on exposure draft, that standard is actually not relevant for Indian companies, and they still require this. So I think it's important that this is a compliance, so it's a shall requirement. And then points that are raised in relation to 220, which I say is much improved. Thank you very much for the work you've gone into that. I think if QM1 is assumed, then given the relationship between the two standards, then I think actually 220 in its entirety should be assumed. But in that case, I'll go through each of those points in the parts as we get to them. I was a little confused about why we were not including compliance frameworks. And I will turn probably to Kai Uwe on this one, because I know that Wolf has a lot of experience in this area. So perhaps I know it's important to include them, and there aren't very many requirements in relation to compliance frameworks. So I think that's an important point to bring through. In terms of the essential explanatory material, I may have gone too far, sorry, no. In terms of the essential explanatory material, which is above 1.5.1, I think that the part that discusses practicality and legal limitations above 1.5.1 has been used, but it's actually missing some important context that this is about fraudulent activity. This implies that generally not all relevant information will be made available. So I think we need to keep that essential explanatory material with the guidance in relation to 240. The issues paper says that there's no obligation on the auditor in respect of essential explanatory material, but in the spirit of the ISAs, I think it should be. And then we talk about professional skepticism in 1.5.7 involves performing procedures, but it's actually designing and performing procedures that you need to think about. And in terms of 1.5.9, I think there is some real essential explanatory material that needs to go in here, such as the distinguishing features of professional judgment and the exercise of professional judgment in any particular case. So, but these I will send all of this to you, but rather than going to the detail on this call. But those are some, at the moment, some high level points on part 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Ada?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Tom and everybody else. On part 1, I'm in agreement with the approach, and we will, and I will send through comments that I have in respect to this. I am wondering, and this is triggering a little bit, not just here but also elsewhere. This is this is very fundamental for the understanding or for the audits of LCEs, and I wasn't entirely comfortable that the EEM is sufficient to sufficiently bring across these critical elements that needs to be considered for the purpose of every audit. So I would encourage to have a look at this. I also, and this may be because it impacts how I will review and what comments I make in respect of the various parts, Kai, is that that I need to, for myself, introduce some level of understanding of what I consider an LCE. And if it's anything bigger than that, I probably would have to re-review it. And it sits a little bit with and I will consider some quantitative metrics because that helps me. But I personally struggle to see an entity with more than 50 people or with revenues in excess of 15 million. Those to be less complex entities. So that's for myself a little bit of a threshold that I will use in reviewing this. I'm worried that that others may have a much wider area of scope, and that will and I think that hampers the effectiveness of the discussion that we could have. But I'm just throwing it out there. This is what I will use for these type of entities, and if in subsequent discussions this threshold becomes larger, I will have to re-review the document for that. Sorry to go back to the scope and applicability, Tom, but at least I wanted to provide the context from where I am providing the comments. Thank you.
So, actually, I think that's, okay, I'm not going to speak for the task force here, but I think, and not commit people to numbers and things like that, but I think the direction of travel that you're doing to help focus the discussion on the substance is a good one. I think the task force heard the clear message about scoping last night. I think the question is whether this is, where do you draw the line based upon the materials? And, at least that's the mental image I have in mind when I read this. I'm not sure, I don't want to commit the task force. Kai, is that a convention broadly that we could agree to without,
Sorry, I muted myself again. Yeah, I think you need to do an exercise like that in your own background, trying to consider what type of entities are. And I think, as we explained yesterday, it's difficult to do a size criteria and an international standard. That probably needs to do when it's implemented in the jurisdictions. But the thought process that you're going through, I support, and I think that's the type of considerations that needs to be in the back of our heads when we go through the different parts. You need some level of this is what I consider to be an LCE when you discuss that. So
yeah, and I guess, like, if I think of the distribution curve, the normal distribution, you would be I'm thinking more of as an economist. I think of the distribution probably being preponderantly in that class that you talking about it, and I think that would be a useful construct, at least to avoid the discussion about scope continually through every part, because you will have to face it. Josephine, I see your hand went up, so it's probably a matter of clarification or a two-handed response.
Yes, thank you. Sorry to jump in. I absolutely agree with Ado on his considerations in terms of where he is thinking when we're looking at an LCE, and where we started with the discussion paper in particular and described the qualitative characteristics of that. So in that same vein, the comments I'm making, I am trying to make in the context of that type of entity at that end. If I feel that there is something, however, that implies that you're at an upper end, then I might raise it just to point out where I don't think that's necessarily appropriate for that type of entity. And any other concerns I might have. But even where I have concerns about requirements, for example, that perhaps have not been integrated, it is with that lens too, with that smaller end lens. So I will progress as well on that basis. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, by show of physical hand, can we live with this convention for today so we don't focus on scope and applicability questions implicitly on every topic? Wendy?
Sorry, I was agreeing.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I didn't know if that was a disagreement. Okay, so we have sort of a convention to work with today on this. So the next person is Imran.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back with you today. Kai, appreciate your messages around your recap, particularly your commitment to take yesterday's input on board and to consider how the issues that have been raised can be solved. I value that very much, and I wish you well. In respect of part one, again, here I have sent through some comments, but in the interest of transparency, I'd like to raise some of the most significant ones here. The first is the paragraph as it relates to definitions. And I must admit that I didn't understand this when I submitted my comments. Having look at it again, I'm still not sure what 1.2.1 is saying about the status of the glossary within the handbook in the context of this ISA for LCEs. And I really would like to ask the task force to look at whether it's kind of making the distinction between words in the glossary that are definitions and words in the glossary that are not definitions, and what does that actually mean? The second one is a term that's used for the first time in a few places in part one, and that term is versions of premised on, the word premise. And there are a number of things in this part that are premised on a whole lot of other things. And I'd really like us to look to see whether we understand what the legal basis for saying one thing is premised on another thing, and what does that imply if we say something is premised on something else? Does it imply that all the requirements of the things it's premised on become applicable in the standard? Does it imply that compliance is taken as a given? Does it imply that if you don't have that, you can't do the standard? I really appreciate that common usage of the word premise is really fleshed out a little bit, so we have a more uniform understanding of it here. The third and last point relates to the blue blocks. Well, I still haven't gotten used to the idea of calling them essential something, something, something. But what I'm trying to reflect on is comments we heard yesterday where people said, board members said that some of the blue blocks came in the way. Other board members said that these blue blocks had material that may have been too prominent. What I found in this section, and there's really two examples of it here at least. One example is the very last sentence, the last blue block, which uses the words needs to. And there is another sentence in one of the other blue blocks that uses the words is necessary to. Needs to and is necessary to sound like requirements to me. And I'm therefore unsure how I read this essential application material that says is necessary to in it. And whether that points to actually EM that ought to be a requirement. And in fact, there may be a case or two later on in the document where in fact there is a blue block that has a shell in it. And that shows you how marginal it is, that it could have missed our eye, and that what we put into the EM is actually something that ought to be rather in the standard. So thanks for the opportunity to make those comments.
Thank you, Imran. Sachika?
Thank you, Tom. I just raised my hand because I have a very similar view with what Josephine said about compliance framework. I think this standard also address compliance framework. And in addition to that, I think we also need to clarify that, special purpose, framework is also okay to address, okay to apply, because according to my stakeholder, they are audit for very, very small entities that use special purpose frameworks or compliance frameworks. And I do think clarification is necessary that either for SE can be applied to the audit of such entity, because now there is no requirement that address special purpose, and also mapping document explain that compliance framework is not applicable in here. And it seems to suggest there is, that cannot be applied, but I think there is no intention to scope them out. So maybe we need some clarification about that. That's all, thank you.
Okay, I have a couple more, but maybe it's easier since compliance frameworks have come up a couple of times. Clarification from Kai and Bev.
Thank you. When we did this, we had not included the compliance framework so that would widen our scope. So if there is a clear need for that, I guess we can look at that again to include some more on it. So that's, I think, would be an easy.
Okay, well, it
would add content to the standard, but it can be done, but then we would be widening scope.
Okay, it was just more of a clarification of whether it was in scope or out scope, as some people wondered. But it's for the task force to consider. Kai Uwe.
Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon. I have a brief comment. I'm still working through the papers, in particular on the mapping documents, so expect to give detailed comments by early next week. Like Josephine, I do believe that compliance frameworks need to be included, since it is SEs that use these frameworks in many countries, including Germany. I would prefer the definitions to be in an appendix to the standard, since the glossary of terms is non-authoritative. If reference is made to the glossary of terms instead, it needs to be clear that for the SE standard, the glossary of terms is authoritative for the standards. Thanks, that's all.
Thank you. Wendy?
Okay, thank you, Tom. I am very comfortable. We will get to a more precise scopes and applicability, so I don't need to repeat that. So in this section and throughout, I am focused on looking at this document holistically, and the user experience and potential test drive. So a couple of things that a couple of things that I'm not clear on. The glossary we already talked about. The linkage to the ISAs. Will I go back to the ISAs for clarification? Will I be able to just look at this document? I'm still not clear directionally where we're going, especially with the definition underlining, which does take you back to the ISAs. And then my only other point in this section, and I will probably refer to it again, is the documentation piece. I think it's really important that it's clear what needs to be documented as you are going through this audit. And I had recommended yesterday, but I'll say it again, perhaps we put all the documentation requirements in, obviously it'll be throughout, but also in the appendix. That's it. Thank you. And I will send through a full document with some other nits and observations early next week.
Okay, that's the final comment on it. So Kai, back to you, and Bev.
Thank you. The compliance framework, I think we've addressed already, so that we can look at. We got some suggestions on some of the parts of the EM. I think most of the content in the EM is actually taken from the ISAs in the application material. But we will look at the wording again. I mean, our intention is not to have requirements hidden in the EMs, the same as we should not have requirements hidden in the application material in the ISAs. But I think there might be some cases in both this standard and in the ISAs where we're inadvertently sneaking in a requirement, and we will try to look at that again to take that out and then consider if there should be an additional requirement on that or not. On the word premised on, as you pointed out, Imran, we use the same concept in ISAE 3000 and ISR, or ISAE 3000 and ISRE 2400. So we use in the same context as we use there. So it's not really a new concept in our standards. One thing that I want to have some further clearance on is that on the definitions, to highlight it that it is a definition that we used in the text. What we have done is underline the first time the definition is used in each part, so that you would recognize that it's actually a defined term that is used. So if we can get some direct feedback, if that's helpful or not, I think would be really helpful for us to get some feedback on. Other than that, I think we're the comments received. Thanks for them, and looking forward also to getting some detailed suggestions and comments in the written feedback.
See, Carol, and then Philly.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everybody. Is a point that I made yesterday, I believe, but I want to make sure that it stays live. It is important that the standard also contains the clear message that the audit has to be of high quality, because that's in the public interest. And that message could be built into the preface, but if the preface is not part of the standard, then it should come maybe under fundamental concepts and general principles. I think that is important and could also be helpful for those members in the board who have doubts about whether this should be, can be a high quality audit. So I would make that clear in the document. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. The point was noted last night in the preface discussion, but I appreciate the further elaboration. Philly?
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to add to what Kai said around the concept of premise. Basically, what we're doing is, remember, we've got certain buckets of standards. So in the ISAs, premise is used in ISA 220. In the ISAE series, premise is used in 3000. In the 2400, in the review engagements, it's used in 2400. And in related services, it is used in 4400. And really what it says, and that's the same way it's used in this standard, because remember, this is a standalone standard. It is used to say that is the foundation that enables you to apply these requirements to achieve the objectives of the auditor. So you cannot really go into an audit and think you can apply these requirements and achieve the objectives if you are not part of a firm that is subject to ISQM1, and if you are not complying with the relevant ethical requirements. And so that's just, that's why we build it into this standard as well.
Okay, Imran, and then let's move on to the next topic after Imran.
If I understand correctly, the topic we're on now is part 2, right, Tom?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this morning, Kai, Morten, Hagen, and I got up early, and we had a very early morning chat. And we both complained early this morning that we had very sore calves and thighs. And Kai reminded me it was because of all of the mountain climbing that we all did together yesterday. So I hope we all recover from the climbing we did. I have 3 comments on part 2. There's a nice example in part 2, and that example is between paragraphs 2 to 12 and 2 to 13, and the use of the term, if applicable. I can understand its usage in 2 to 13, but I wondered whether it also therefore wasn't needed to be used elsewhere. And I used 2 to 12 as one example of an area where, for example, differences of opinion would only, the requirement would only become applicable if applicable. And maybe some thought related to that. The second comment was in relation to structure of the standard, and I'm using part 2 to describe the issue, and that is the way we've used shells. So we've used shells within part 2, and there's a great example. The example is in paragraph 2 to 6, where there is a shell in the lead-in, but there's also a shell in the hanging paragraph below the list. And I think that it would serve our board in the long term if indeed these are separate requirements. They would help with referencing, they would help with methodology, they would help with tracking changes, because if we talk to the requirement in 2.2.6, which one are we talking about? And it may cause more change in order to get it right, but I think that clarity is necessary so that the nub of the requirement is clear. That's the one issue around structure. The other issue around structure is illustrated nicely by 2 to 11 or 2 to 12, where the lead-in has a shell, but it's followed by a long list of A, B, C, D, E. And that's a feature of this standard. Many, many examples of this throughout. And I really would appreciate hearing Kai's view about Kai Morton's view about this, whether he considers that to be one requirement. So was 2 to 12 one requirement, or is it 4 requirements? And I guess my reaction and thoughts about it will follow in here after hearing that. In saying that, I thought simplification would be if they're listed individually for the same reasons that I've described before, for compliance purposes, for methodology purposes and such things, because it really seems like, for example, in 2 to 12, we put a whole list of unrelated things together. For example, not dating the auditor's report. So it just some reflections on where that is. And in describing it here, kind of the task force may want to look at how they're grouped together in other parts of the standard, and whether that's that grouping together remains logical. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll have Kai respond. I assume that Josephine and Diane are on the next chapter already and just are anxious in queue. Kai, any response to Imran? Bev, any response to Imran? And then you could set up the next chapter, and then we'll go for the next round.
Yeah, I think what we've done is trying to, as you've seen, rewrite some of the requirements, not to have multiple shells. I think, as I outlined yesterday, there are still some cases, and we will look at them. Some of them are like what you said, the hanging paragraph with an additional shell. Some of this may be conditional of something happening, but we will look at that again. I think on whether the intro has a shall and then has a bulleted list below, if that's one or multiple requirements, I don't think that really matters. If it's 1 or 5 requirements, it's what expected to be done in the requirement that really matters, and the expected output. So if we get to the same point by having it combined in what you would call one requirement, having bulleted lists rather than having long sentences as we may have in the ISAs. If we get to the right area, right place, we probably still should be fine. Bev, do you have any additions that you want to add on this? No, I think what we try to do is rewrite and make it easier to understand the work effort needed, and focusing on the output in the requirements. And we've gotten positive feedback from that from the reference group and others as well. So if we want this to change, I think we need some further direction on how we should address that comment. I think then on part 2, as we then jumped into here, I think I will start in December. We got feedback from Josephine, for example, on ISA 220, and thanks to Josephine, we've reached out to her and gotten some feedback that we've tried to address in what we have here. So thanks for Josephine for spending some time and doing some additional work with us to help us progress the standard. And I think a general thing is that we tried to keep as much as possible of the engagement quality management piece together. Some of it we have moved to the the part where it is more related, like acceptance continuance and matters for consideration for conclusion when concluding. And there are a few we've identified something or one requirement that probably should move. 2.2.10 probably should move to the concluding part and should not state the auditor shall determine. It should probably say the engagement partner shall determine. So that's a couple of the things that we have identified going through this after posting the documents. So I think, but I think we should go back to having the comments on part 2.
Okay, comments on part 2. Well, Josephine.
Thank you. So I'll start because you did specifically ask about definitions. I like the idea of underlining the word first. I think that's fine. I think it's actually quite a good idea. And similar to Kai, I'd like to see the definitions in the appendix if possible, or it is accessible and clearly accessible, and where it's accessible is in the standard itself or expressed in the standard itself. I didn't mind the summaries of taking, say, an ISA requirement that has A to G and putting that into bullet points, except where I felt that the summaries had changed the meaning of the requirement, or for some reason the words had changed with no specific reason why. So, but some of those will crop up as we go through it. And just generally on 220, your point about moving to the relevant parts, I think that's great. I continue to completely support the process approach. I think it works very well. And so with that, my comments will be on part 2 in particular. In terms of the objective, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm still very concerned that we've actually reduced this to, or reverted this to, a compliance-based objective. And as a consequence, the key change to develop a link to how the actions in 220 contribute to audit quality have been removed. We worked very hard on that aspect of the auditor fulfilling the responsibilities. And that was very much linked to behaviours and audit quality. You know, thinking beyond just the compliance audit is really important in the context of delivering a high quality audit. And of course, that same amendment was made to ISQM1. So in some ways, we're departing with what we have in the QM on which this standard is premised. So that's on the objectives. Some of the rest of certain paragraphs are missing. One of the things that I still feel very strongly about is the behaviours in 2.2.2, which have been deleted from, which have not been included, which have not been included in this standard. Those again were very much part of our objectives when we launched this project on 220 to improve behaviours. And I generally don't see why, even in that smaller end that we're talking about, why behaviours aren't important in a small audit as they are in a complex audit. In fact, in some ways, those behaviours are easier to achieve because you're dealing with a small team and you can discuss things. And to some extent, behaviours like, you know, around making sure everybody understands their responsibilities around skepticism, they're also overall responses in our standard too. So whilst I see there is some repetition in some of those behaviours, I do think they need to come back in. In terms of 2.2.3, I can, again, this is where we've streamlined some requirements in 220, but actually now we don't have an actual requirement for direction, supervision and review. It's almost implicit. But given this is such a critical aspect of the audit and delivering on audit quality, it really needs to be a separate paragraph as it is in ISA 220, or certainly brought in as an actual requirement in this standard. And in terms of, I'm just looking through because I'm not going to cover everything because we just don't have the time. There's one area where we've changed a responsibility that belong to the engagement partner to the auditor. So for example, in 2.2.10, we really did spend a lot of time as a board discussing each and every one of those requirements we introduced into 220 that belong to the engagement partner and justified every single one of them. And the board agreed with that. So I don't think we should revert back to auditor where we made that change only very, very recently. And for that, I'll leave the others and send those along. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. Just a couple comments on section 2, and a little bit of this is connected to what Josephine alluded to. I really believe that making sure that the work papers are reviewed by somebody with the appropriate level of experience. Sometimes these audits are being done by well-intentioned but fairly junior and experienced auditors. And so I really do think the concepts of reinforcing the importance of reviewing and supervising the audit is critical. And when I look at 2.2.9, the opening sentence doesn't cause me too much concern, but then there's a comment in the blue box: the engagement partner need not review all documentation. And I get concerned that that just sends a bad message. I'm comfortable with the tee up to that, which reinforces that that executive needs to look at matters that are significant or contentious, although I again would pause and say, how many contentious matters should we have on an LCE engagement? But I get uncomfortable with that sentence that the engagement partner need not review. I think that can be literally taken, unfortunately, by a team and say, oh, great, I don't have to look at it and move on. And then we've got a real significant impact potentially on audit quality. So just think about that sentence. And then in 2.2.12, this is another one that is a little bit interesting. The blue box talks about the concept that if you're going throughout the course of the audit and you come across something that might be particularly complex or unusual issues, we say it may be desirable to consult. But it doesn't say that that kicks you out of the LCE standard. So, which I'm a little surprised by, because this seems to imply that if you come across something difficult or contentious, call somebody, consult, but you can still stay in the standard. And I think potentially, I'm not sure if that was your intention, but I think potentially we would want to have a more formal stand back and say, because I've come across this, am I still eligible to stay in the LCE standard, or do I need to come out? So I would just ask you to think about that. And then an overarching comment is I did struggle a bit with just the order of the chapters. I'll refer to them as chapters. And we can get to it, but I do think the placement of chapter 3 on audit evidence relative to it's sitting between engagement, quality management, and acceptance and continuance just struck me as a bit odd and maybe not consistent with an audit flow. So nothing major there. I think that's just a question I had about the flow of the chapters. And that was it. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. I have, that's the last of the hands up. Kai, do you want to respond? And one of the things that may be useful on the task force, Julie, speaking of QM, is on the task force. It may be useful as a QM guru for your perspective too on how we thought about bringing the QM suite requirements into this LCE standard.
Do you want me to go now, Tom?
Kai, is that, yeah.
Okay. Agreed. And Josephine, thank you for those comments. We did take a hard look at it. We did think that the objective with the words of managing quality and obtaining reasonable assurance that quality has been achieved got us there. In fact, we took a second look at it, I think, just to make sure that we hadn't left anything out, because we know that the quality management standards are applicable here and are important. And so it's not to say we couldn't take another look at it, but we did take a couple of looks at it already, and we're comfortable with where we landed and thought that that really drove the message home as to what we thought needed to be in the LCE standard. So I guess just to add my support behind what the task force has included with respect to QM and 220 in this section.
Okay. Kai?
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for explaining the process we went through on that. I think, as you said, we've looked at this multiple times now, and as a task force, we're comfortable we're in the right position, and we also get the feedback from others, the reference group and others, that some of even think that we have way too much in here, but I think we may need to get specific feedback on what to be included and where we can go then if we need to do more. On Diane's comment on consultations or contentious or difficult matters should drive you out of the standard. I think we had so part of the discussion that we had in December was that the auditors or the auditor's response should not drive if you're in or out of the standard. So so that if you would be driven out by the standard if you needed to consult, that could be taken as then auditors would not consult if needed. So the feedback we got in December is that we should not build based on that. I do think that even though it may be less, there may not be as many consultations in LCE audits, but there should be an opening. So we haven't said that if you have a consultation or if you come across a matter that you should be scoped out, but so that's the reasoning behind that. We wouldn't like to have the applicability be driven by the auditor's response in a way, because then it could be addressed in a not the way that it should have been. But looking forward then to see if any suggestions on where we can go further on this. But I think, as Julie explained, and we now said, we've had multiple looks at this, and if we're to do more work, we need more direct what exactly we need to do. Some of the blue boxes in the text we will look at, so that they're in context. Some what was pointed out here, so we can look at that. But in general, we heard from a few people, but are we at the right level or are we not? I think is the direction we need here.
Okay. Should we move on to the next chapter?
Yep. I think we can move on to part 3, which then is audit evidence. I think we heard from Diane that she felt that the placement was a bit out of order. We can look at that. I think the intention was that to have or the audit, the part 3 is used throughout in the standard, so it doesn't only apply to what you do in the parts around addressing the risks. So but if it should move before part 2 or how that should be placed, I think is then the word or where we need to get direction. What we will do is add some more around external confirmations. We're a bit light on that, so we need to add some more content on that. I think other than that, so we then should open for comments on part 3, audit evidence.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, and hello everybody. We also struggle with the placement of this chapter 3, but I think we already had a discussion on that at last IAASB meeting. So I think we even had a vote and we decided to leave it there. Now that we see it with all the detail, it's still strange. So maybe we can reopen the question. But more than that, it's the title of this section that I cannot understand. Of course, 3.2 deals with audit evidence. So we give the title of the part of the chapter that is the title of a single part. And when we look at the other single parts, the other subchapters, some are not really directly related to what we call audit evidence. And having in mind the discussion we had on Monday on what is audit evidence, and but we are trying to clarify, but we are not trying to reinvent what is an audit evidence. We are just trying to define it better. To me, it's not matching the content of this chapter. So I think we need to change at least the title, and ideally the title and the placement. Thank you.
sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. Sue.
Thanks, Tom, and good morning, everybody. Since it's the first time I've spoken, I was just going to, Kai, respond to your direct question about the definitions. Had reasonable feedback about that and the underlining. Similar suggestions about maybe it could be in an appendix, or I also wondered whether when we get to the position of having this electronically, then having hyperlinks is probably the easiest way to go with these kind of things, but comfortable with where that is. In relation to this section, I had a couple of comments. One around perhaps the balance that we've given to a couple of different things. I felt there could be more in there on external confirmations. It is something that's used commonly, and perhaps more on the kind of how to do those. I thought, looking at the balance, there was more on dealing with updating procedures that were done at an interim position than there was on external confirmations. And I would argue that kind of interim work would be unusual in this kind of audit. And then secondly, I felt there could be more perhaps on the LCE specific fraud issues. The fraud section to me seemed perhaps a little sterile. It was very similar to what we have on larger entities, but I think there are probably some less generic, some more LCE specific areas that could perhaps be picked up and discussed. Thanks.
Thank you. For those who notice, I'm calling on people who haven't spoken yet today first, just to give them an opportunity. So I'm not ignoring people. Lynn.
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to pick up on 3.5 laws and regulations, which I didn't see relating to audit evidence, and I just found it all a bit strange. It starts with the blue box, then it says the auditor shall remain alert, and then says not required if nothing happens to perform audit procedures. It just didn't hang together for me under audit evidence. And I also thought it may be more sensible to pull all the stuff together on fraud and laws and regulations together in one place. Currently it's spread, and I'd find it easier to be able to address it all in one section. I haven't got a view about what section that should be, but I am struggling with where this is and what it says. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and Kai for leading us through the material. On this section, I've had similar comments to others, just in terms of the layout and structure of the section itself, and whether the ordering makes sense. I had the similar comments to Sue around the confirmations. I think that's something that will still be an important feature of an LCE audit, and some of the process there needs to be considered. And then a couple of detailed comments in 3.3.2. It references using analytical procedures as risk assessment procedures. And it seems to imply that the auditor would be using a 520 kind of approach to those kind of risk assessment procedures, which I think was not intended. So you might want to just take a look at that, because 315 actually indicates that you're not required to use 520 when you're using analytical procedures as risk assessment procedures. And then we struggled a bit with 3.4.1, which is dealing with the fraud considerations, and the introductory wording there, where it says the auditor shall include specific considerations with regard to fraud when. And it was just not clear to us what we were really talking about there in terms of what are those specific considerations with regard to fraud that you're referring to. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Len?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kai. This is the first time making my remarks today, so just want to echo on the support for the way you handle the terms and definition in 1.2 and 2. In this area, I think I pretty much on the same page as others. I would prefer, in terms of the structure of the standard, to be aligned to ISAs. So you start with the part 1 is fine, and part 2 you can debate on whether acceptance and continuance should go first or quality management go first. But I think that since this standard is going to be built on the body of ISA, so probably a nicer flow if you use the same chronological order as ISAs. On all the evidence, part 3, similar to other people, this is a section that consists of, as far as I can tell, 5 different standards. You're looking at 240, 230, and 550. So I'm not sure. This part 3 gets quite confusing. We're talking about less complex, but this chapter is probably the most complex of all the chapters. So probably I'm thinking about how to segregate the different buckets. Also, that early opening box you have under the title, the objectives, they don't really hang together because there's so many standards into this one particular chapter. So ideally, I would like to see all the evidence to focus on all the evidence and procedure to obtain all the evidence. Other stuff depends how the task force decide. Probably go back to the logical order in the body of ISA and assign an appropriate place. Other than that, so far I like everything is done in the first 3 parts, and a lot of good work. Thank you very much.
I think Zoom needs to stick you in one spot on the page and allow you to stay there. I've moved to the second page. Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yes, I had similar observations as were already raised in respect of the title and the contents, and I think Len worded it or phrased it right. I had a suggestion, given that it deals with audit evidence, fraud, compliance laws, regulations, related parties, overarching communications and documentation. I was wondering whether a title, something akin overarching requirements, would help. Because that captures those various standards that Len also referred to. And Kai Morten, thank you for raising that confirmations need a bit of work. I tripped up on it, and particularly in light of an LCE. In an LCE where you would expect fewer staff with broader responsibilities and potentially less segregation of duties, I think an outside confirmation will help you quite a bit in those type of audits, and as a result, what an auditor actually needs to do, well, needs to stay in control, and particularly applying professional skepticism if management refuses you to use external confirmations. That would be a red flag in my book. So appreciate that that you've already flagged that you're going to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I also echo what others said about title and some need for restructuring the content of this part 3. My comment is about documentation, because 3.8 include overarching documentation requirements. Through my communication with my stakeholders, I heard view from the auditor of LCE type entity that the certain implementation guidance might be very helpful after, of course, ISR for LCE finalization, because that my understanding is that one of the biggest burden during the audit for LCE is documentation. I know that overarching requirement is included here, and other specific type documentation requirements are included in other parts. And I support that direction, but it seems that unclear about how far this standard contributes to the reduction of unnecessary documentation burden. So I think some type of guidance will help auditor to consider such point, especially for audit of very, very micro entities. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Imran?
Am I there somewhere on the screen? Can you see me?
You are.
Thanks. In respect of part 3, I just want to pick up on what was said at the end of the part 2 conversation by Diane on the blue book, on the blue box of 2.2.9. Really in agreement with what she said there, and especially in agreement with what Josephine said regarding the engaged partner role on part 2. I share the comments on the title, but though I had a slightly different thought about how it could be solved, recognizing lens count was 5, I kind of thought, because I don't know the ISAs as well, Len does, that maybe there are 8 or 9 ISAs that are referenced in here, that potentially part 3 needs to be split into 2 parts to make this more manageable. Another way of looking at the problem we have is that there are close to 50 requirements in this part. And so splitting it up may make it more manageable for the audience that this is being described for. The second comment is 3.1.1, where we have got the use of the pen here in the objective. I think this is a good example of what we described yesterday when we spoke about why the icons would be problematic, because the pen icons being used here to describe a documentation issue, but actually we're within an objective, not dealing with a requirement, and we'll end up with those kinds of challenges. On 3.2.4, this is a professional skepticism iconed paragraph, but it begins with the use of the word may. And so I've really confused by what could be therefore the authority or purpose of a paragraph that talks to professional skepticism that's flagged with the icon, but it's merely just a may amongst all of the shells. I appreciate there's a shell later on in the sentence, but thought that needed to be looked at. Then a general comment. There's the first example of it is in this part, and it refers to something that we've used in the blue block in 3.3.4, and that is the words need not be. Also, we use the words need not in one or other place in this part. And so I thought that we really needed to think about the usage of these words. There are 3 usage times that we've used need not to be in the standard. I think we would need to remove them or find a consistent basis to use them, as there should then just be only 3 such circumstances in the entire ISA for LCE standards, which I don't think is true. I don't think there can just be such 3 such circumstances where something need not be done. That is, there should be many more need not be situations. I can draw a similar comment about the 9 usages that I managed to find of the term need not. I disagree with some of them because, as we know from previous board conversations, if we say need not, then they become de facto requirements or negative requirements. And we need to look carefully at those 9 wherever they appear, please. Following that, 378, this is a good example of something that I raised for the first time in the last paragraph, and that is that we have a blue block that precedes 378, which is duplicated entirely, word for word, in 378. So written communication need not include all matters that arose during the audit. Actually, that sits in 378 and it sits in the blue block before that. But I described the problem issue as to what goes into the blue blocks. And this is really just an example of one very close to each other where we can see what needs to be addressed. I think this may then be the last point, and this is the consistent use of adjectives. Again, part 3 provides a great platform to see this. And the heading in 3.8 is the example that I would like to use. The adjective here is describing a documentation requirement as being overarching. Now, we don't have a meaning for the word overarching, but in practice, it can be understood to mean different things. And I don't believe that by including such adjectives, we help to enhance the standard. I think we have to make it vague and unclear, and probably the kind of thing that the CASP team will be looking at, especially Tom, especially Kai, when within our own standard, we reference these documentation requirements elsewhere as being general documentation requirements, or yet somewhere else as being broad documentation requirements. We describe the same documentation requirements using different adjectives. And instead of trying to work out which is the right adjective to use to describe them, I might think that a thorough scrub of these adjectives would have to keep it straightforward. This is what we mean by these requirements, and nothing more than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Josephine.
Thank you. So I'm just go through what's been said before. I agree with Eric's point on analytical procedures. I agree with Sue's point on the fraud considerations. Kai and Ado on 505, we're definitely missing some of those red flag points are critical even in an LCE. And as I say, particularly where professional skepticism is important. Going through, there's I think potentially as well, the analytical procedures, perhaps at Eric's point, could easily be confused with sampling techniques. So perhaps some just tidy up there. There is some issue in my mind around audit sampling. So, and there's quite a few things, like for example, you might misinterpret some of these requirements as it being okay to ignore deviation. Deviations and tests, for example, deviations and misstatements are being combined when of course deviations are relevant to tests of control. And so I've got some points on those which I'll send along. It just seems that in the summary we've perhaps missed some important aspects and some clarification there. In terms of, I'm just going through the ones we've already discussed. I wondered if perhaps actually, to other people's points, those specific considerations with fraud, they might actually be better placed in the part 6 and part 7 rather than try and deal with them here. In terms of the remaining alert for related party information, 3.6.1, the point here about dominant influence is related to fraud risk factors, and that's in paragraph 19 of the actual standard. And this seems to be mixing up two ideas. So without this, there's no context for the purpose of A. So perhaps go back to that and have another look at that. The one that is slightly surprising is that in terms of the requirement in 250.29 to report instances of suspected or actual no-CLAR to an outside authority, that hasn't made it into the standard yet. We're again in that LCE space, we're still dealing with regulated entities potentially. So charities, for example, in the UK are highly regulated and auditors are required to report these matters. And I think just because it's obvious that you would do so, I don't think that necessarily means that that requirement shouldn't remain in the standard. So perhaps have another look at that. Just going through, sorry, there's a lot in this one, apologies, I'm trying to avoid the little bits. Yeah, that's it for this one for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Two more, Diane and then Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. Well, Josephine took some of my thunder. My two comments, and I agree with the overarching comments about, to me, it seemed that we had a lot of topics in this chapter and it might do a disservice by bundling them all together. And so I think some of the suggestions breaking apart are good ones. The two ones that I felt particularly strongly about were the confirmations. And as several people have said, I think there's some key elements in the ISA 505 that talks about the control of the confirmation procedures and so on. I think that should come over. And then the other one that I felt quite strongly about was audit sampling. Again, sampling is a key part to an audit. It's an area that many auditors struggle with. I think there's a section within ISA 530 that is kind of an overarching step back and say, okay, has your sample actually helped you and enabled you to conclude on the account? I think that's a key piece that's missing in here. I also think sampling is a key area for documentation. It doesn't have to be a long epic novel, but what's the auditor's thought process about how the sample was picked and so on. So sampling and confirmations, in my mind, again, pretty key audit procedures, again, whether it's a small company or a large company. And so I think just some revisits maybe to those two sections. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. Kai, first of all, I have to say that I agree with most of the comments shared by others. And I want to just bring a point of view, maybe from a different perspective. When I read the whole document and maybe especially this chapter, I tried to read it from a practical point of view, which means, does it really make sense for you as an auditor to understand what the requirement is trying to say and what's the extent of the work and what you really need to do outside in practice? And maybe this chapter is not perfect. It doesn't really flow 100% accurate, but at the end of this section 3, I got the message what I need to do. And maybe some of the requirements are not very detailed or specific, but with 2 lines, it clicks. It really tells you what you have to do, and you as a practitioner, you understand what you have to do. And hearing some of the comments, which probably from others are asking about more detail or a section that needs to be expanded or critical issues in practice, I share them, I understand them, but that's bring the point to me that users of this document are reading the content in different ways. The technical guys very focused on details, very focused on being specific what to do. More practical guys thinking about, yeah, I understand what I have to do outside. It makes sense, and that maybe is a takeaway comment for the task force, that the document is never going to be perfect, but people outside would read it in a different way. Less experience probably will struggle just with 6 or 7 pages about audit evidence, but others with more experience wouldn't really have so many issues. But that could also bring some inconsistency in the execution. And I think that's part of what we're trying to avoid, because that inconsistency could impact quality. But we still need to keep in mind that at this point, because most of the people who will read the LCE standard are very knowledgeable in ISAs, so everything just makes sense. But after a couple of years, maybe that split will start bringing some issues, and I cannot really say how we will solve it, but maybe it's a consideration if there is a need to do some kind of maintenance in a more regular basis to bring that concept and avoid that inconsistency in what we do today. Thanks.
Josephine, are you following up Fernando? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, no, I agree with Fernando. What I'm struggling with, and we did touch on this slightly yesterday, is what lens are we looking through then? Because I'm trying hard to look through the lens of somebody who's no experience in ISAs at all. And then if I'm saying, well, this isn't particularly clear, you might need to clarify, you might need to bring more steps, I'm doing it through that lens, because Otherwise, we're going to get very confused about, well, let's assume everybody does have experience. Well, okay, if we are starting there, then that's a different lens. Or are we trying to build this standalone standard? And I know we did touch on it yesterday, but I think it's important that we know which lens we're looking through. And Fernando's quite right. As soon as this hits the streets, there will be, of course, lots of experience in ISAs, but that will dissipate. So where do we start? And that's slightly worrying me. I can't work out what lens we are, or the task force want us to look through. Sorry.
Okay. We did get, thank you for that perspective at the end, Fernando. Kai, we got some pretty consistent suggestions throughout, which makes at least the task force consideration more easy. I think the philosophical question that Fernando tried to get put on the table, I just think it's an important perspective to have in the back of our mind, but I'm not sure we'll resolve that right now. Kai, back to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the comments being raised on this part. I think it's right, as you said, this is a part that is different than some of the others, and we tried to group together some of the requirements in a place so that we could tackle them up front, because a lot of the content that is here could apply throughout the different parts as we go. So that's the reason for having it being split out. We did get some suggestions that we should change to flow. We did have some specific discussion on that in December, and we got support for following the flow of the audit. We also got some support for that now, but someone suggested we should go to a different flow. That would be substantially changing what we are doing, though. So I think we're following what we are doing now, and we will take into consideration the feedback we got on some of this. And I think the name is awkward. I think we probably had, yeah, I don't think I can count the number of different names we had on this section. Maybe Ido's suggestion of overarching requirements is something that we should look further into. At least we will look into seeing if we can have a different name. It's an odd one in the bunch, as you say, and we will need to address that some more. Some of the negative requirements, as you reference, Imran, the approach that we've taken there is actually looking at the ISAs and the negative requirements that are in the ISAs. And we've gone through each and every one of them and made sure if they're applicable and brought them actually in, and they're more or less word for word the text that's in the negative requirements that are in the ISA. So the negative requirements that you see here, I think would be you would recognize them all from the ISAs. We've done that exercise to see, and that's actually where they're coming from. Sachiko, you mentioned around documentation that you need some implementation guidance or additional support to start using the standard. And this is something that we have discussed earlier as well. And we recognize that there needs to be something that comes out together with the standard. We are working with others to help on that. I think our discussion so far, we've both looked at IFAC and also maybe NSS to help on some of this. So there needs to be some additional material that goes out with this. And I think I don't think we fully can solve the documentation issues that the auditors of LCEs bring up in the standard, but I think it's something that needs to be done in conjunction with additional material, maybe examples and so on. So there is something that needs to be done there, and we recognize that, but it may also be done by others. Yeah, I think we also have some, we will look at some of the use of the adjectives to see if there is consistent. I think though that some of them have the same meaning and draw the same baseline. I do appreciate Fernando's commentary that's looking at the part overall. He gets there, and I think that's that's what we're aiming at. And I think that the lens that we are looking through. I think we need to be mindful that we're not writing this standard or the ISAs to be used by any person coming off the street to do an audit. In order to do an audit, you're qualified as an auditor in your respective jurisdiction, and there are some basic assumptions that goes behind that, so that it's not written for anyone coming off the street. I know that you know that, but it's through that lens. These requirements are written for the audit that is being done, not all the details on how it's being organized in each individual. So it's going into the requirements necessary, not the work, how the work would be divided in each audit. But we'll take the comments that we got here with us and then try to address them as we go further.
Thank you, Todd. Josephine, is it on this section? Or okay.
I'm really sorry, Kai. I wasn't at all clear, and I do apologise. Absolutely, we expect anybody performing an audit under the ISAs would comply with the various jurisdiction requirements to be an auditor in the first place. I absolutely accept that. So apologies. What I meant was purely, do they have experience using ISAs? Are we looking through that lens? That's all. So I just wanted to clarify that point because I clearly was misunderstood. Thank you.
Okay. So I think we've concluded the third part now. I suggest we do the fourth part before we break. However, one thing is I'm noticing a lot of consistency in comments, and most people, as when they've heard something that they've said before, refer to it and just say I agree. I want to, so we could get through as much as possible, some discipline on that. I will use my chairman's prerogative to change order up so people feel like they're getting first go, so they're not always at the end of the line, the questions. But we will need to do this if we're going to get through and provide the task force as much feedback as possible. So let's go to part 4.
Yeah, I think we could potentially go to the break before we take that part, so that then we can organize to see if we should jump ahead in the order of the numbers to get feedback in some areas where we specifically need. So I would suggest, if that works for you, Tom, that we take a break now.
Okay, we could do that. I always take in the views of my task force chairs. So we'll take a break. It's 8:23 my time. Everyone could search for the leprechaun in the 10 minutes that ensue, and bring me back a pot of gold. We'll reconvene at 8:33 my time. Thank you.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. I've been able to listen to most of it on the way home, so yeah, I had it on Renee's phone. So thanks for letting me in. What time do we start back?
8:33.
Okay, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye.
We're going to start in a minute. Okay, could we commence again? Okay, so what we're going to do to make sure we're going to focus on the parts of the document that the task force needs most feedback on and thinks where there's likely to be the most feedback is to turn to part 6. Then we're going to go to 8 and 9. And if we have time, we'll circle today or in the future, circle back to 4 and 5. If we don't get to parts 4 and 5 today, we ask you to send your input to the task force for their consideration. Is that an agreeable plan for everyone? Okay, thank you. So let's turn to part 6, Kai, and give a little bit of an introduction there.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the board for allowing us the flexibility to jump a bit around in the papers here. But I think this, as you explained, this is an area where we've done more changes, and we would like to get the feedback on that. As you all know, this is pointed out as a pain point from some of the LCE auditors, and we've tried, as we've explained in the issues paper, that we've focused more on the outcome, on what the auditor needs to do, rather than the understanding the piece itself as a background to on what you need to obtain. I think I pointed out yesterday that requirement 5.5.4 around the standback on the applicability really should be in part 6. So you should consider that as it really should be in part 6. So just having that in mind. I think all the work we've done here is on balance with the board or the task force. We think that we come to the right conclusion and the right effort here, so that we really need your input on the work that we've done and if we get to the right place or not. So with that, Tom, I think you turn back to you to get the input on part 6, risk identification and assessment.
I feel like I'm back to where I started when I joined the board. We were doing risk identification and assessment, and I feel like the spirit of Fiona hangs over us as we touch this topic. Any comments on risk identification and assessment? Isabel.
Yes, thank you. My point will be really overall and the perception we shared with a lot of practitioners that are involved daily in the audit of less complex entities, and the overall feeling was that we have too much and too detailed requirements in this section, if we have the scope right, so if we have really the less complex entity, we should be able to size down this part of the standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. I have a few technical points on the section 6. I guess the first one comes up in 6.2.2b, which is talking about the analytical procedures. And it seems to imply that there's a work effort here that goes beyond what is required under 315 and ISA 240 as well, because it talks about that the analytical procedures should identify unexpected trends and relationships, and it seems to imply then that the auditor needs to develop an expectation, and we're not sure that that's what's actually required in the other two ISAs. In 6.3.3e, it's taken the requirement in 540 paragraph 13H and kind of condensed it, and we think that's going to be pretty confusing as it sort of relates to, when you're dealing with significant risks. So we think you might need some explanatory material on that requirement just to help practitioners deal with it properly. Had some general comments around specific requirements, 6.3.6, 7, 8, and 9, where it talks about shall consider, and that's been done deliberately to replace the shall evaluate words, and we're just really not sure about that approach. it's not that significant in the audit of an LCE, but it may be misunderstood in terms of how it should be applied. And I know we're waiting for the CUSP group to help explain what those two terms really mean. But I think in the meantime, it's going to result in inconsistent work, and certainly in my view. And lastly is 6.3.9. Where we think making reference to significant without it doesn't have the word significant in there. It's dealing with something that's in 315 where the word significant is used, and so we think it's needs to be brought in when it's talking about the classes of transactions, etc. So those are some detailed comments for consideration for Kai. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thank you. Kai, I've also got some detailed comments which I'll send through. The one area that I wanted to pick up here was on understanding of internal control, because I think that's one of the big pain points in practice. And I wonder whether there was an opportunity to explain, whether through guidance or examples, why it's important to understand internal control in a fully substantive audit, because I think that's one of the hurdles in practice that comes through. I think it then plays into documentation. So I think there's an opportunity to explain the why this is important to support the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom. I made this point briefly yesterday, but I want to make it explicitly today, and that's 6.5.9, which talks about potentially moving from the ISA for LCEs back to the full ISAs. I think that is one of those umbrella things that should be further up in the standard rather than buried here. And I also think it's important. It's one of the areas where how you do that isn't clear. There is no standard on it. There is no particular requirements. So being clearer about how you do that, I think it would be valuable. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Diane?
Thank you, Tom. A couple comments here. I think one of the things that's probably most important on this chapter is understanding the business. And especially when you think about some of these LCE entities, they may be entities that are contemplating a significant transaction, a significant change of business. I think of biotechs here in the Northeast in the US. They are small companies. Some can argue, are they not complex? Because they could have complex items, but they could be looking at a significant transaction like an IPO or something that would really change the nature of the organization. So I would underscore and maybe reorder some of the elements in this chapter to bring forward the understanding of really getting behind the business, its objectives, its strategies, and understanding that. I think that might also make sense then to take a step back again and maybe just reconfirm that we're in the right standard. So I would just ask you to maybe think about some of those ordering of the chapter. I agree with Isabel that I think there could be a potential to look at this chapter and really condense it down to focus more specifically on the needs and items affecting an LCE. We may actually have too much stuff in this chapter and we want to get a little bit more focused. And from a technical perspective, I think when you go to section 6.39 and 6.310, which is where you're talking about the classes of transactions and the accounting estimates, I think the ISOs say you only need to consider significant classes of transactions and significant estimates. And I think that keyword of significant is missing from both of those. And you may have an opportunity to bring that more into focus and bring that back to the standard. And that's it. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Diane. Imran.
On part 6, I think that some very good points have already been raised. I like Diane's last point raised about understanding the business. What's interesting here is that the issues paper describes the reference group's comments in this area to be rather thin. There are just 3 bullets on the reference group. I could draw the conclusion from it that the reference group may seem to like it, but I would reckon that this is still really big and complicated, and I really wonder whether a pointed question to reference group would be useful in this area. What's really necessary to understand, and Tom and Kai, this is the challenge here, is after having read all the many paragraphs and requirements in this section, is a clear understanding, hopefully, that the task force can give us is what is the impact of all of this on the work effort versus the ISAs. So much has changed, so much has been merged, so much has been reworded. How will risk identification assessment be different? And really appeal to you from the perspective of somebody who's not a practitioner. Help me see that in a clearer light, please, if that's at all possible. I think what this part needs, and more than one speaker before me has referred to it maybe, is this is the area where we need to have some exit points to exit the LCE highway. Because as one gets a deeper understanding, which some may argue you needed to know before you made the assessment of applicability, you needed to know some of these things. But as you get to know them, well, shouldn't this be well signposted that therefore you may have to leave the standard at this point if indeed this crops up? And that's possible when one looks at the discussion, for example, on ICT in this section. Some of it is so complex when it describes deficiencies and problems, you can imagine that it would point to say that you're not in the right place here. Last 2 points, I think that 6.59 needs a documentation requirement like 5.5.4. And finally, the interchanged use of shall understand and obtain an understanding. I have forgotten what the difference between the two is and whether this is something within the scope of the CASP project, whether they're going to help us to make it consistent and understand what it is. But I guess crucially, I want to know its interchanged use. Does it matter on audit effort, or does it very specifically chose one over the other? And what does that mean? Many thanks for allowing me to make these comments.
Thank you, Imran. Bev.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought I would come in here, and I know there's still some people to talk. So we have looked at this section in a lot of detail. I think we need to remember that we have a brand new standard, ISO 315 revised, and we've made some very important changes in there. So we can't really come now and start taking some of those important things out. So what we have done is we've tried to focus on how we can get this or similar outcomes. Obviously, it's not going to be the same outcome, but similar outcomes using different words, but that the auditor's actions are more appropriate in the audit of an LCE, and that's what we've tried to do here. So it is very, very difficult to reduce it a lot more than we have here, but we will look some more based on the comments that we got today. But we have been looking at what we can do, and Imran's just flagged one of them, and that's the understand versus shall obtain an understanding. And maybe in some places we just need to relook at some of the things that we've done. So in particular in those areas around the understanding of the components of internal control, again, on the use of the word evaluate versus consider, I think we've been picking up some chatter on ISO 315 around the work effort that's required for an evaluation. And I think when we wrote ISO 315, it's part of your understanding. It's a sort of I'll just use the term light touch evaluation. It's in context of that component of internal control. And that's not come through clearly in ISO 315. And that's why we thought if we used a different verb to describe the work effort, you'd still have a similar outcome, but using a different description of how to get to that outcome. So that's what we've been trying to do in this section. And then just with regards to sort of the exit point, I think 6.5.9 is meant to be the stand back for the exit point, because you've made an initial assessment on whether you're in the standard. you've now gathered a lot of information, and you may actually get to the point now where you know something you didn't know at the start. And so we've struggled with where we put the stand back. So 6.549 is meant to be the stand back and the exit point. And we thought it was the most appropriate place at the end of the risk assessment, because that's when you would have the most knowledge, but before you start doing all of the audit work. So maybe we need to make that a little bit clearer as to what that is. And I think Kai had mentioned that the documentation requirements in the wrong chapter. So that will come to be the documentation thereof in this chapter. But I just wanted to explain some of the thinking a little bit around some of the changes we have made here. And they are slightly different words that we've used to the ISA, but we do think that the outcome of using those words is not going to be hugely different. And we've tried to explain a little bit of the why as well in some of the way we've described the requirements. We've kind of flipped them around. And obviously, I think, Sue, you raised that perhaps we need more of the whys. I had tried to add some of the whys in because we do think they're important, but again, we'll have more of a look to see at what how we can describe the whys a little bit better. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Ida?
Yes, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Bev, for clarifying this a little bit. I had comments that were similar to Eric as to 633, 639. Those have also been made by others. Maybe, and this is something where I've struggled a little bit, because I understand and I appreciate the comments that Bev just made, but for example, in 632, where we change the requirement from 540, which says, and the degree to which the selection of the methods, assumptions, and data are affected, and then leave out selection, I think that changes the requirement. And I'm not entirely sure why that has been done. And then there's other examples, maybe in 633, why data has been deleted from that requirement. So that makes me pause every now and again and ask myself whether I need to increase my rigor on that mapping document. But yeah, these were two that were examples of how they work in, and as a result, I'm a little bit on the fence every now and again when the mapping documents as well. It's effectively getting to the same answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Josephine?
Thank you. A similar point, actually, Odo, we're aligned this week. This was one part that I was really nervous about, and I do appreciate Bev's interjection there, and the point that we have just revised this standard and it's just out the door, and we're actually not even in a position to test its implementation at this stage. So one of the areas that I picked up a lot of points on is where we have actually changed the words, where I really haven't understood why. And I recognise, Bev, that you've picked up some of those where we've changed consider to evaluate, but given we don't know the outcome of our current standard 315, it's difficult for me to agree that therefore we think it will be the same outcome, but I do appreciate the point. There are simple things like I don't understand why we've changed the terminology from entity system of internal control to entities internal control system, for example. These just feel like, they don't feel like real valid changes or there's any evidence as to why they should be changed. So I've got quite a few points on those. As a consequence, some of the points that Ado raised and that Eric raised, and I am where we appear to have changed some of the requirements, and certainly then we're not going to have the same outcome in that situation. Missing words like significant, that's a critical part of ISA 315. So rather like my point about 220, but that's a critical part of 315, so I'm not quite sure why that happened. Also in this one, this is a very complicated area, and whilst it's Imran's point, it is big and complicated, it is some of the most fundamental aspects of the audit. Therefore, I really do think this is one area where you would need to really tease out some of that essential material, like how do you actually apply those inherent risk factors? What do they actually mean? Again, through the lens of someone who does not have experience in ISAs. And even at that bottom end, understanding what they are and their purpose is important to then actually recognizing that they are proportionate in the environment that you're working in. Again, because I have so many points on this, I'm just going to send them along at this stage, but it's really, really critical that we try and stick as close to 315 as we can, given we haven't actually seen the outcome of that standard yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tom, I apologize for coming back in, but I offer this just, and maybe this is for my own, purpose, but Bev, your comments on the words consider versus evaluate, as an auditor, we're so focused on the details. And I think, as others have said, the words are really, really important. And I just offer that when we change words from evaluate to consider, I think this leads back to the overarching comments you heard last night, which was at the end of the day, when you go through this standard, are we doing a sufficient extent of work to ultimately support that audit opinion? And so I don't know that answer, and I don't mean this to come across as very negative, but I just food for thought in terms of if you come back to the overarching comments we had last night and you say, for an audit, you need to do these 10 steps, and for an LCE, we need to do 8. But by the way, out of those 8, we've actually changed some of the words within that 8. And then you start looking at this in the aggregate and the aggregate and the aggregate. This is where I personally come back to what comes out the other side. Have we done enough work to support that audit opinion? So I think, again, getting back to the mapping document, really understanding what was it carried over, understanding where we changed the words. I know that sounds like a lot of detail, and I apologize for that, but I just wanted to provide some context that these are examples that may cause, at least it's causing me to take a step back and think about what the standard is actually producing. Thank you.
Okay. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. I'm sorry to bring back in scope, but I think once we precise the entities that belong in this standard, we may have a better ability to look at, let's take 315, and maybe the things that we've assigned or said consider versus evaluate and change some of the words, maybe we don't really need them. So I think the scoping exercise is really what's going to make a difference in this standard. And because I keep circling back to this has to be holistic, and something I learned very early on in my auditing career, if you had 8 hours to do an audit, what would you do? And we were talking about, audits of many, many hours. So I think about this standard the same way. And I do believe we have to stay true to the words that we are taking from other standards, but that we might not need to take all of the attributes of those standards. Thank you.
Okay. In some ways, that was one of the key points that Josephine raised up front. We know the scoping issue will be addressed. There's some caution about changing of words. I heard that about whether we really be cautious about changing words and what the intent is behind it, I should say. There were a number of substantive comments too in this section that the task force will need to consider. Kai or Bev?
Thanks to the board members for giving their comments. I think you pointed out some of the things we need to go back and look at. Significance really should be in there, so it's dropped out somewhere. And so also Ida brought up some other areas where we actually need to go back and look more. So thanks for bringing up some of these issues. I think we, based on this, have a better overview on where we need to go and what we need to fix. So I think we got good input here. I think then we should move forward to the next part. I think then again we probably we would like to go to part 8, conclude and evaluate. It's an area where we haven't really done too much changes from the version that you had in December, but we want your feedback on this part, and then we will go to the reporting section next. I think just to point out in the beginning, so that you don't need to bring it up, is that there is a letter missing in 8.8.2. H is missing, so we already know that. And I think we could just open for comments on the concluding and evaluation part. So back to you, Tom.
Concluding and evaluation. Any comments on this part? Let people turn to the notes. I assume that some of it is scrolling forward a little bit. Or Bev, great job. We're done with this section. We can move on, right? Josephine's laughing, so I know that's true. Joseph.
I'm just trying to, sorry, I'm being slow. I'm just trying to work out which of these points to raise. So please bear with me. Apologies.
So
I'll kick off while Josephine's sorting her notes. So the only comment I had really was in the subsequent events area, where the requirements have come down quite extensively, and it was really a question as to whether that could be possible of being operationalized without the full understanding of the standards. So the question really was whether we've gone a bit hard there. Thanks.
Okay. Seems like there's a common tension about how much in, how much out on all these sections. I think we're clearly, there's like a Goldilocks type approach to get it just right, which means that inevitably some people will think something are too much and too little. And I think whatever we do in consultation, whatever we call the consultation, will be particularly around these points of what's in, what's out, once we identify appropriate scoping. Diane?
Hi there. I just had two comments. One of them was on the CAMs and whether, again, we really think a CAM would be relevant to an LCE. So I just ask you to think about that. And then the second one, which I feel pretty strongly about, is the draft audit report and the fact that we've got an appendix. Again, I'm thinking about, this is an audit. At the end of the day, it's an audit, just as if it's a big company. And I think by virtue of the fact of creating an appendix, you are dismissing, in my mind, it could be viewed as you're dismissing the importance of those elements, of which the two elements that are in the appendix are management's responsibility and the auditor's responsibility. Two really important concepts within auditing that help the user understand what went into producing that opinion. So I feel really strongly that we shouldn't have an appendix. It should be a standard opinion. And I think that's it. Sorry, I don't know if we were going on to the auditor's report, so I may have jumped the gun on that. I apologize.
Not quite yet. So we'll hold.
Okay, sorry about that.
We'll hold that comment on the auditor's report, but note that you've made it.
Sorry.
Josephine.
Okay, sorry about that. I kept flipping back through various different sections. I couldn't find chapter 8. So in here, the task force have removed the reference that the evaluation whether the assessment of risk remain appropriate to occur before the conclusion of the audit. And it's important that that evaluation occurs before the conclusion of the audit, as suggested here, that it's at the end, because it actually means that you might have to go back and do some more work. So some thoughts, some changes to the words there have actually changed the point at which you do this evaluation and potentially the meaning. There are some aspects of the requirements in 620 that I think are still relevant. You know, for example, if an expert is being used, then it is possible that expert's work does still have significant judgments, assumptions, and methods, which all still need to be tested for reasonableness. So I admit that that response is in respect of when we were thinking about having those more complex estimates, but some thought there when you start funneling down the scope, whether that might actually still be an important assessment by the auditor. There's some areas around misstatements which haven't been included. So there's an absent requirement for the auditor to consider management's responses and what to do if the management refuses or corrects some of those misstatements. And I think this is a red flag one as well. So it's about the fact that there's some skepticism here that you need to fold into this requirement that's missing from the standard. And if management does refuse, then that has implications for the audit generally and not just for the individual misstatements. So some aspects there are some other aspects of misstatements I've made suggestions that probably ought to go back in. Also, I think that there's been some changes to going concern. There was a comment made that some aspects of going concern won't be relevant to an LCE, but I actually don't think that's the case at all, and that's not what we heard from our roundtable. So I think maybe relook at some of the requirements that are absent here and quite critically and carefully. I think I said earlier, I may not have said earlier, but one of the points that was taken out of the 570 requirements was to look at the cash flow forecast, but in the same vein, that company might be using Black-Scholes models. So it's not consistent. So perhaps have another look at those, that'd be helpful. And then there are some aspects of 240, which I think some of the requirements have actually changed. So this one does have, because of everything that's covered here, this one does have some changing requirements. Then, of course, you won't be surprised to hear that I think the taking over responsibilities actually changed the meaning. And I think, if anything, this has made it more complicated and more work. So I won't repeat what I've already said about the fact that this doesn't actually portray what we were trying to achieve with 220, but I'll send those notes again. And then the others, there are some editorials as well. I mean, one thing I will say though is I do like all of this being brought together in one space. So years ago, there was an attempt to actually have a standard that dealt with this. And I actually thought that was an excellent idea at the time. And I'm sure if Diana Hillier's listening, she probably thought so too, given that she was chairing that particular task force. So, and I really like to see this, I really like this work being done here. But again, another area where I think we've changed the meaning of the requirements in a lot of places. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I agree with a lot of the comments that Josephine made. The one comment that I have in addition to that is that I was wondering that this section starts with concluding and then deals with analytical procedures, subsequent events, written representations. And I was just wondering whether that is the order in which you do this, because I would think you do all the other work first before you conclude. So suggest a task force to look at the order of how this is brought together. Thank you.
Thank you. Imran?
Yes, 3 short comments here. I was wondering what 8.6.3 was trying to achieve. But I must admit that on more than one occasion, when I tried to look things up, I realized, oh, well, maybe this just came from the ISA and I was ignorant of its existence within the ISA, had forgotten about it. So I'm asking that about 8.6.3. And then on 8.9.2, which is about the assembly of the audit documentation, I had a really curious comment from someone within the regulator who asked, if we take the approach that the audit of an LCE needs certain concessions, which result in fewer requirements, why should it also not have certain things tightened up? For example, why should it take 60 days to wrap up the file of a really small audit? If we accept the applicability of what we're talking about, there's not group situations envisaged here, not complicated working papers. Why is this not something that should be wrapped up in 2 weeks after the report is signed? And that opens the door to a whole lot of thinking about, oh, well then, why is this merely a set of concessions, not just a framework of other things that an LCE audit could be done a lot tighter or better in, because we can be so focused in our requirements. But just amusing, I know it's not within the scope of the project proposal. Thank you, Tom.
It's interesting that you said concessions. I think that's an interesting concept in this regard. I wasn't of the belief we were making concessions per se, because that seems like a reduction in work effort. I'm not sure that's the intent, but it's an interesting point that you make, Imran. Wendy?
Thanks, Tom. 3 quick points. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed Imran's comment on can't we archive the files sooner, is a pet peeve of mine overall. I was in this section trying to figure out if we had all the engagement completion and concluding items. It was a little hard for me to follow, so maybe that could be separated. And then my other comment as I got to the end was those charged with governance. I do believe that that is not an attribute that would necessarily go into scoping, but I would like to see, and I think it would be helpful for the stakeholders that are part of those charged with governance, all of the communications in one place, from the engagement, acceptance, to the planning, to the completion and conclusion, the communications and the documentation required for those communications. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no other hands on section 8. Kai?
I think I will start with the last comment first on the communication or the those charged with governance. We try to single them out in each part by the communication requirements that are there, so that it should be there in each and every part. So we try to address that. I think also we've tried multiple different direction here as well to do that. I think overall, I think doing this standard in the basis of the project proposal, we've not made the standard more stringent. So on the archiving principle, for example, if it should be a shorter period of time, we haven't considered that because we're following the same principle as in the ISA, not making it more stringent on the similar requirements. There is we got some detailed comments here on some areas where we need to go in and do some more and consider if we're at the right level around subsequent example events, for example, as Sue brought up. Considering the type of entities that are being audited, the amount of subsequent event most likely would be less. So you may have lesser need to have the same amount, the same in there, but I think we do cover the principal requirements. So it's some of those balances, as Tom pointed out, the Goldilocks as well, that we need to get to the right point, considering the type of entities that are being in place here. Yeah, I think Imran, you pointed out one requirement here where you wasn't sure if it was something that you could find in the ISOs or not. I think I said yesterday that we have identified a few requirements now that have been left over from where we started. So this may be one. So we need to go back and look at these requirements to see if they still should be there or should be taken out. It's something we'll do for the next draft. Considering the comment on key audit matters, as you had, Diane, the discussion on the feedback we had is that most likely these entities will not have key audit matters, but if someone would like to report on that, should they be disallowed from using it? So that's the approach taken. So if you're voluntarily reporting on key audit matters, you could do that, but then you need to comply with 701. Yeah, I think that's highlighting the content from the comments we got on part 8.
Yeah. Interested in the 701 comment. I'm sure that will come up in the context of our next section. It's one of the points that I flagged myself. Do you want to lead off with section 9?
Sure. This is then going towards the really end of the audit, the reporting, part 9. Given that we had the discussion with the board and also in other outreach that we got the feedback that the auditor's report should look a bit different than the ISAs. That is what we tried doing here in the appendix where you have the example audit report. We tried to make it a bit different from the ISAs to differentiate it. So it's more than just a reference to the set of standards that's different. So what we're bringing to you now is also to test if our approach, if you agree with the approach that it should be different. I think, though, if you wanted, you could also report based on a full ISA audit report, referring to the separate standard or changing the applicable parts. There wouldn't be anything restricting you from doing that. But we wanted to test the approach on having the on the concluding part, and also I think we already had a discussion on the compliance framework where you say we need to bring that in, then probably some more needs to be put in. So we also earlier talked about the supplemental guide on auditor reports that we would like to test out. So is that approach something that we could use, or should we, and do we need to include all the reporting requirements and examples in the standard itself? I think that's, I think we all already had the discussion a bit on 701. I think we explained that. So I think then we can go to opening for comments on part 9, reporting, then also some comments on the appendix 6, the sample auditors report. So back to you, Tom, for comments on part 9, reporting.
Yes, okay, great. Comments on 9. Now, Diane, I cut you off on 9. Did you have further comments that you wanted to make on 9?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just didn't
Apologize for going out of order.
It's okay. You get one of those each.
Yeah, can I just, yeah, I'm new, sorry.
No, I'm joking. It's good, all good. Could we get Yash?
Thank you, Chair. And the auditor's report is most important for the public interest because auditor's report is the only information from the auditor to financial statement users. I have just 2 comments about the auditor's report. I support the requirement to state in the audit report that the audit was conducted in accordance with the ISA for LCE. From the viewpoint of ensuring further transparency, I would like the task force to consider also stating the basis on which the auditor determined that the ISA for LCE is applicable to the audit of that such entity. For example, it could be stated that as the company is not a listed entity and has a less complex governance structure, the auditor has determined that the ISA for LCE is applicable. And the second one is, as the ISA for LCE is set as a standalone standard, I suppose that it is not reasonable to extract only CAM requirement from the full ISA in the audit report. Especially the CAM is selected among transactions and areas where there is a high estimation uncertainty in accounting estimates, or where management is required to make complex judgments. If so, such transactions and areas should not exist in a less complex entity. Rather, if the auditor wants to state an audit information in the audit report, it would be more reasonable to include such information in other matter paragraph of ISO 606. Actually, the ISA LCE has a requirement for other matter paragraph at paragraph 9.6. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Yosh. Sachika.
Thank you. I have two comments on part 9. The first one is about a description of the responsibility of those charged with governance. I think the draft does not include paragraph 35, I think, of ISO 700, which requires auditor reports to include description of those charged with governance. And I think it seems to be a bit inconsistent with the fact that the draft addresses the auditor's responsibility for communication with those charged with governance. I think it is quite important, and I would like to know why the auditor's report in accordance with ISO for LCE does not include the description of the responsibility of those charged with governance. And the second comment is about ISO 800. First of all, apology for talking about applicability again. Also apology when I mentioned about compliance framework previously. I think my comment was not very clear. I think we also need to clarify that special purpose framework can also be used, because requirements ISO 800 are not included in part 9, and it seems to suggest that auditor cannot use ISO for LCE if the entity uses special purpose framework. And at least in Japan, there are statutory audits for very, very small entities that use special purpose framework, such as labor union. And I do not think scoping them in does not inadvertently expand the scope, because the applicability criteria that entity is LCE should be met anyway. I think perhaps it is just a matter of clarification similar to compliance framework. And maybe you don't need to add requirement, but just we can clarify somewhere that it can also be applied to special framework. So perhaps you can think about that. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Ida?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I have very similar observations as to the CAM as Yosh articulated it. So I'm with him that I don't think it's necessary in here. In respect to the auditor's report, arguably at this end of the audit market, you could argue that the boundaries of what an auditor does and what he doesn't do may be more relevant for users to understand for the purpose of this audit and this standard. So I'm a little bit on the fence of whether that then should be put out in an appendix or not. So I'll leave that there. And then, to provide another support guide to it, it just raises a question in my mind in how many other documents the auditor needs to consider to do the audit in the context of this particular standard. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. So a couple of suggestions here. I think audit reporting, this is the output of the process, and it's really important that people have the guidance to achieve the desire for consistency in this space. And I think the feedback that I was getting in the outreach was a desire for more in the way of examples. So I'm sorry, it's in that Goldilocks territory again, but it's I think it's an area where there's an awful lot of consultation in practice if a practitioner is in a position where the audit report isn't standard. And one of the suggestions was, maybe an example for the situation where there's other information published. I mean, that's certainly a requirement in the UK, and I believe in a lot of European countries. So any audit will have other information published. And a further thought is maybe something like going concern, which again, is not uncommon in this kind of space. So perhaps if we can reflect on the examples, a question around if the support guide is produced, what the authority of that is, again, linking to the fact that audit reporting is such an important area. And then, like others, not attracted by the 701 link, the experience of voluntary CAMs is extremely rare, and it feels like it's giving a message more that that the LCE criteria are not necessarily met. So would suggest not including that. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thank you. I'd like to start with the CAMs. Being a fan of CAMs, I was pleased to hear that they could be voluntarily used, and that would be my preference. In terms of the audit report, when I read it, I had a sense of deja vu, going back to very early in my career, which was probably before some people on the board were born. This is the kind of report we put out. They were short, they just said the opinion and nothing much else. And I think it's important that people do understand the responsibilities of the various parties. So whilst I'm very aware that cycles come and go and it might be time for a short report again, my preference is to have the responsibilities in the text of the report. I do not like appendices to audit opinions. Also, when I looked at the appendices, the appendix to the audit opinion and the auditor's responsibilities, they're written in very technical language, and I think too many auditors write audit reports for themselves, not for the people out there. And so I would encourage looking at that through the eyes of a user, not through the eyes of a technical auditor. And while I've got the floor, I've been sitting here reflecting on something Sashiko said, and I just want to support her. I think a lot of less complex practitioners are looking for a way to have less documentation. And when I stand back and look at this draft, there isn't a lot of documentation. And I know we are just summarising the ISAs and that, but I do wonder if there is any possibility that we can somehow streamline or in some ways make it easier for people in terms of the documentation. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely accept documentation is important, but I also think it has to be relevant and not over the top. That's it for my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Josephine.
Thank you. So in the spirit of agreeing along with the lines, I agree with Sue that absolutely this is the output and then this is what the users will see, and Yoshi's point about it's the most important part from a public interest perspective. From that perspective, I'm not sure what we want to do. If we want the audit report to look different, then even more I'm concerned about the title of the standard, but that is a minor point in the whole context. If we do, then I suppose you're heading in the right direction. I agree with others though, that I do think we need to build out more on responsibilities of the auditor, particularly if it is considered something different, and certainly of management. There are some requirements that have been squished again where we've lost a little bit. So for example, just as an example, in 9.4.1H, where we express an opinion, we don't actually explain what that opinion, that unmodified opinion would look like, yet we do that with the modified opinion. So there's a little bit of a contradiction in our approach there. I'm sure there's a reason, but it wasn't particularly clear. I think that more is needed around the emphasis of matter, other matter, and the MERG in terms of the going concern piece, because these have already been told, even recently, that these are quite complicated to understand, and we've really shortened the requirements or even the guidance in this area. So I think there's a lot more that can be done along there. In terms of the other information, there don't seem to be any follow-up procedures in the standard when there is lack of inclusion of these important aspects. So, I mean, when these actual matters occur. So it's like it's missing the next step. So where material inconsistencies are identified, then what next is missing there. So that's something that probably needs a bit of attention as well. In terms of CAM, it's currently voluntary. So I can see that there is a dilemma that you wouldn't include it here, but that's sort of contradiction to what we were trying to achieve with that. But then again, so I understand that in a really tiny entity that we're talking about, that it's unlikely that they will report. So I'm really on the fence with that, and could come down either side on that one there. And then I've also got a couple of technical points which I'll send along, where, as I say, there's some sort of, from my perspective, misinterpretation of what the requirements are actually trying to get to. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to say, first of all, I share some of the concerns about putting the responsibilities into an appendix. I think I prefer to see it in a nice, crisp report where it's all in one place. A bit like Josephine on the fence around CAMs, I take the point that they should rarely arise, but I wouldn't discount the possibility that it could happen. So I think it, on balance, I'm supportive of a voluntary use of the CAMs. With respect to the example reports, I'm a strong supporter of the Canadian guidance that we developed. It's been a fantastic resource for practitioners. It is non-authoritative, but it allows you to cover all the different variations and complexities that can come up in reporting. And I think to try and put all of those into the standard would just be defeat the purpose. So I'm a strong supporter of considering doing a guide as suggested. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. On the report format, as some have said, the report is short enough to have everything in the same document and not have an appendix. But I agree, I come from a jurisdiction when it's not common practice, even for the long report, to have an appendix. So for me, it's not a big issue. Like what Eric has said, I think we will never manage to have all the guidance we need in the standard. In France, we did the exercise and we have an application note to the auditor's report standard, and it's more than 300 pages. And we have a lot of details, examples, and we connect with the legal environment in France and the add-ons that you need to have. So all this has to be developed locally. And whatever we do, we will never be able to bring all that in the standard. So I think we have enough as it's proposed in the standard, and it will be up to the jurisdictions with the help of guidance that the IAASB will be able to develop, to build their own relevant guidance. And on the topic of CAM, I strongly feel it should not be covered. Not because it's prohibited. It's not prohibited. It has never been. You can always add CAM in any report, even if there's no mention of CAM in this standard. But if we keep it, and if we have some developments on key audit matters, it gives the feeling that you can use the standard for much more complex entities than the one that we want to have in the scope. So maybe it could be dealt with by a Q&A. saying, can we have a CAM in a report issued after an engagement using ISA for LCE? And the answer would be yes, of course, it's not prohibited. But more than that, I don't think we need any development, because if so, it will reopen some doors that we're trying to close regarding complex entities.
Thank you. I actually, on the CAM part, I find it, my personal view is it's the one place where we directly refer to a specific ISA in the standard. I believe that's a Pandora's box that we may be opening there. Less for necessarily for the considerations of who comes in or who comes out, but I don't see exactly how you could click. I prefer the concept of standalone requirements rather than standalone document, but we could talk whatever it was. But I do believe there may be an adverse consequence for doing that, particularly if there's any divergence over time and the knowledge gap between the two standards grows. So it is a concern that I have personally, and I'm not want to challenge whether it also raises the issue of scope. But I do find it strange that all of a sudden at the end of the document, we have a direct reference to an ISA. QMs are different. They're different standards in my mind, but this is the only direct reference to ISA in my mind as I remember in the standard. And I think we should be extraordinarily cautious if our one of our top principles is that this is a standalone requirement and that you don't need knowledge to refer or fall back to ISIS throughout. So it's, to me, something that we need to consider. I turn it back to Kai. You got a number of things. I think the appendix is an issue in many people's minds, avoided appendix on something so important, but you got some other common comments throughout too.
Yeah, I think we got, as you said, the feelings on the appendix. I think as I outlined this part, we're somewhat testing the concept and the standard sample report that we brought here, and we got the direction on that. So we have feedback there that we need to go back and look at. On camps, I think we did have a discussion on that earlier in December as well, to say that, as you said, this is the only part where we refer to the ISAs, but we could also take it out. It doesn't really change anything other in the standard. It's just to take it out. So it wouldn't make much of a difference the rest of the standard. We did get some support for a supplemental guide. The supplemental guide would then allow us to add more examples and add more guidance on how the different variations of the audit reports could look, and that could be something that's the different jurisdictions could base their further guidance on and developing their own auditor reports. I think most jurisdictions have a variation of an audit report. They probably do not look the same in each jurisdiction, so there are work done there anyhow. And by having a supplemental guide, it will also allow us some more flexibility around how to do that. And we will look at then the special purpose frameworks, as you pointed out, and as Sachiko and Lynn pointed out, we will look at that, and then also look on the specific comments that we got on where we need to go further in the standard. I think then we should go back at some of the parts that we left out earlier. Maybe we should do part 7 first and then go to 4 and 5 towards the end. So part
sounds good.
Part 7 is around responding to assessed risk. I don't think, other than what's explained in the issues paper, I don't think there is too much to say leading into the discussion here. So just opening for comments on responding to assessed risk of material misstatement, part 7. Back to you for the comments, Tom.
Part 7. Eric?
Thanks. You know, and maybe this is just a question. You know, I was struggling a bit with 7.417 and how it relates to the applicability section of the standard. Because I think the applicability seemed to suggest that you could use the standard when you have access to all the records and information that you need, and yet 7.4.17 seems to suggest that you may not have all the access to all the records you need. So I'm just confused how this interplays with the applicability section. Thank you.
Thank you. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. I have just one comment about the fraud. As for the responses to fraud, the procedures related to management override of controls are described in paragraph 7.4.5 and 7.4.6, but there is no description of the requirements for overall responses and assertion level responses to address the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. I have the impression that the level of requirements for responses to fraud is more decreasing than full ISAs. I have just think. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, that's our comments on 7. Ty and Bev, do you want to react to the questions that were raised?
I think on fraud, the requirements that we do have there is worked back into the audit process. So we should have the requirement that you're looking for, but it's worked into the process. It's difficult to align them 100% then with the ISAs, because we've taken let's say the topical standards like fraud and worked them back into the audit process. So they're somewhat disturbed or distributed throughout the processes where they're relevant, is what we tried doing. So we think that we should have the requirement. No, the requirement is in there, but it's in a different part. And the interplay with application, as Eric pointed out, with 7.4.17 around using service organization. We don't have a use of service organization as a criteria or as a in the applicability now. We did have that in the previous version, but it's not a specific one that we do have there now.
Great. I wonder, Kai, for the purpose of our time, whether we want to wrap sections, I think it's 4 and 5, the remaining 2, together. If you want to introduce that, and then we could take comments on that and bring it to a close on this topic afterwards.
Yeah, I think there isn't really too much to lead in, but the part 4, as you said, the acceptance continuance, and part 5 around planning. Again, I don't think there's too much that we've changed in here from what you may have seen in the December version. I think, again, just pointing out that the documentation requirement 5.5.4 should be in part 6. So we already know about that. So then opening for comments on part 4, acceptance continuance, and part 5, planning.
4 and 5. Josephine.
Hi. So in the terms of engagement, I think it's really important now that the fact that the audit's being performed under the LCE standard should be a requirement. And that's back to the point I think we talked about, I can't remember if it was yesterday or today now, about the rationale. And it is quite possible that there's a conversation with management about which auditing standard you're in any situation. And certainly wouldn't want auditors to be pressured by management to just do the audit under this standard when it's actually not appropriate. So I think some of that rationale that we built into 2400 might be usefully built in here. And that's, it was yesterday we were talking about that, I believe. Really minor point, but can you just pop back to Natalie as to why we didn't move the term client relationships from our QM standards? I know it was discussed at length, but I can't for the life of remember why it was important. So just to pop back to her, and she may remember. In terms of the predecessor auditor activities, paragraph 9 of ISA 510 has not been included, and I'm not sure why this has been removed, particularly as it's still relevant in the circumstances. So if a predecessor auditor has issued a modified opinion, you really need to do some work around that and follow up. And I don't think there's enough baked into 4.4.2 that makes that clear. As in, it might be that, well, it's obvious, but it's not, because remember that we're looking at the lens of someone who hasn't dealt with ISAs before. We're doing 5 as well, aren't we? I am concerned about the removal of overall audit strategy and plan. I totally understand why you've made it simpler, because essentially at the end of the day, it's all one big scope and direction and timing, etc. But there were some important requirements that related to each of those. And I think by mushing it together, we've now missed some of those. For example, the audit plan has to include a description of the nature, time, and extent of planned risk assessment procedures. And that's not anywhere now in this standard. It's not in the documentation requirements, and it's not here. And that's a very, very critical part of the audit. And therefore, I think it's really important that plays, and it's just as relevant to an LCE audit, in my view, even at that bottom end. And then there are other planned audit procedures that are required to be carried out so that the engagement complies with this LCE. That piece is missing as well. So a little bit around our audit evidence discussion about how important those other procedures are. The engagement team discussion in 5.2.6b, that there's or 5.5.6, this changes the emphasis on the requirement to be more generally about fraud and error, how it could arise from related parties, but there are some specific discussions there which are taking it from a different angle. So again, I think there's a meaning change there, so perhaps have another look at that. And then just bear with me. Yes, if the auditor's using the work of an auditor's expert, then the onus is on the auditor to make sure that they have sufficient competency to understand the subject matter given to them to be able to judge whether the expert's work is adequate. That is a really important part. We can't, and it's very important in terms of avoiding any kind of just undue or unnecessary reliance on an expert. The auditor really has to understand as best they can what it is they're looking at, but that's not been baked in here. And I think, you know, if we are in this expert area and this is staying moving forward, then we need to bake that piece back in as well. A couple of other points. Yeah, again, we're missing some important aspects of 570 as well, but you know, I've made my point that I don't think it's anywhere near sufficient requirements in relation to 570 have been baked in here. I did find some of the requirements and materiality confusing, and given that there aren't many, I think in this particular case, I think just sticking to what's in the standard is probably the best approach. I found it more difficult to understand what we were trying to get to in simplifying it. So perhaps check back and really maybe just go to what we have already said. And then just the 5.5.4, you're documenting changes, just maybe some little EEM on the practicality around that piece as well. And those are the key points in these particular sections. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Similar comments to Josephine's, just real quick. I do think the discussion in 5.2.2, which I believe is the audit plan, I think that is a key documentation, so I'm surprised we don't have a symbol next to it. I also think some of the elements in the ISA are not carried forward that Josephine alluded to. So I think that's really important. That's a key element of all audits, is the documentation of the audit plan, what was considered, what was evaluated. And then the second comment is there's a lot of discussion about management's expert, which again, I just take a step back and say, if management has an expert, is it really an LCE? And what is that expert doing? I think, again, this is something that pops in and out when we talk about examples or certain topics. It just strikes me as if that exists, that may not be an LCE. So I just question that. We devoted a decent amount of paragraphs to that subject, and I'm just thinking about the relevance. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wendy?
Hi, thank you, Tom. 3 quick points. I think the auditor has to document how they came to the conclusion that the entity qualifies for LCE. Similarly, in the terms of engagement, those charged with governance and management, and if those charged with governance are not in the terms of engagement separately, they should agree with the decision that has been made to be an LCE. And then initial engagements, I think Josephine talked about opinion modifications, but I was looking for some reference to transitioning in and out. If it's an initial engagement and it was done under LCE, maybe that goes in the regular standards if it's going to move to regular ISAs. But the other aspect I considered is if it was done under LC, and again, maybe this belongs in the other standards, but maybe there needs to be a reference to it. What if an audit was done under LCE and I don't agree? So I don't know how to address it quite here from an initial engagement perspective, but it's the transitioning piece. And then to my thoughts on the expert might be different than Diane's. So I guess this is point 4. I was thinking that a really small company might not have people on staff to address some areas that you might need an expert, and they might use an expert in a situation that I could see might not be complex. So I think that that probably needs to be clear, and again goes back to the scoping. So I wouldn't be concerned that the expert implies too complex, but I think we have, again, a lot goes back to the priority of determining which entities belong in this standard.
Okay, understood. Kai, you heard some comments about the sections 4.
Yeah, we got some specific feedback here, so we need to go back and look at some of that around experts. I think Wendy's the explanation at the end there defines our position that the use of expert may be that the entity is less complex and doesn't have it itself, so that we could use the expert, so it's applicable to have in, but it do go back to, as you said. Yeah, I think yesterday I talked about things that we still have to do, and one of them is the transition to and from the ISAs. It's something that we will look at for the next version, so that I think cover up some of the comments that we got here. And around initial engagement, we'll take us a new look at some of that as well, to see if there is something more that we can do here.
Okay, great. Take a deep breath. We're through the draft right now. One time, what I do know is, based upon comments, that many people still have some substantive and editorial comments they have yet to submit, and that's forthcoming. I would venture to say for the task force that sooner is better than later. because timetables are relatively compressed, and I know the task force wants to turn to next stages quickly. I guess right now I want to thank all of you for your active and open participation in this discussion. I want to thank Edo, for providing us a good construct for being able to focus on the words on the page for today. So thank you, Edo, for sharing your mindset today, because it worked for a lot of people. I wanted to thank the task force members for all their work to get us to this point. I particularly wanted to thank Bev for staying up 27 hours in a day to get the document in the shape that it is. And I go back to what people said at the outset, is that it's amazing to see how much was done on this document in such a short period of time to facilitate the type of conversation that we had. And then once it was done, someone asked for the mapping document, which was then faithfully approved. And so thanks, Bev, and of course, Nikki, who's come in to help support Bev in this project. So huge gratitude and appreciation for that. Kai, I'll go back to you and give any parting thoughts on LCE.
Thank you, Tom. And I think, as you outlined, and we said earlier, comments that you we're open to written comments, as you said, sooner rather than later. If we can get them by early next week, that would be really helpful for us, so that we can plan how to move forward and how to progress this. Also, thanks for all the comments that we received, and also thankful that we managed to stay on giving the feedback on the actual parts today, not going back to the discussion on scoping. So we actually have something substantial, some comments that we can progress on and move forward. And I think so that, and again, I would just thank the task force, the work they have done, and as you said, especially Bev, on the amount of work that's been done. I don't think it can never be, it's a lot. And so without her, we would not have been able to do the heavy lifting that we've done to the standard, and then have the discussions, and also for Nikki for coming in and helping on the mapping. So thank you very much for that. Hopeful then that we can get some good input and suggestions from the board members that we can further use to further progress some of this, and that if there is a need, we may come back to some of you to discuss some of that. We'll see based on the comments that we get.
Thanks, Kai. Jim Dowkin, if you're on, any perspective, having now observed this conversation and reflecting on the CAG input?
Well, thanks, Tom. And I think there's still a number of outstanding questions, particularly related to scoping and some of the other areas that will need to be addressed. But I think I was encouraged by how much progress you made today and last night. So no additional comments.
Thank you. And Carl, from a PIOB perspective, any comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. I think it was a very interesting and useful discussion. I can only repeat what I said yesterday, that developing such a standard requires a lot of courage. It's not easy. It also requires some modesty. Not everything that applies to the large entities is applicable to the smaller ones, and we heard that today. The scope will be a crucial element in your final decision to which entities this applies. And I think it's also important, I heard the comments about how inspectors will look at this. I think it is important to get in touch with stakeholders and particularly also audit inspectors to see to what extent they can get satisfied that what is in this standard can actually deliver a high audit quality, which is the objective of the audit exercise, because that is in the public interest. And in that sense, it is important, and I know it's difficult to do that, but what is essential should be in the standard. And it should be a document that is a standalone document that can be used. Otherwise, it would not serve its very purpose. Thank you.
Thank you for that public interest reminder, Carol. Okay, I know you're exhausted after 2 long but constructive discussions on LCE. However, before you go, your IAASB work never seems to quite conclude. So I have to hand it over to Vili to tell you what goodies are coming over the rainbow for you right now.
Thank you, Tom. So just shifting gears a little bit, looking back at EER. So again, thank you very much for the discussion on EER on Monday evening in New York time. The task force took all your comments away. We had a very good meeting on Monday evening, New York time. And we think we've landed in a very good spot in terms of addressing those comments, including the comments that we've received around Appendix 3. So I'll ask Lynn just now to give us an update. We were agreeing at the task force that we will see if we can post the turnaround document so that the board members at least have 24 hours to just familiarize themselves with the changes. But Lynn, I think you're closer to the work being done, so I'll just hand to you if you can give us an update on that.
Yes, we do have a marked update of the draft guidance. It has got changes, as Vili said, to Appendix 3 and a few other paragraphs. We've also marked up the edits. Pauline and I have reviewed the document, so we think we're on track to get it to you in another 7 hours. So that will be 10 a.m. New Zealand time, around 5 o'clock New York time, and about 9 p.m. on London time. So that should give you 24 hours to review it. I mean, if you read very slowly, it would take an hour, more likely half an hour. So I just wanted to reinforce what Vili said. We have taken all of the comments. We've considered all of them seriously. We haven't been able to address all of them, of course, where there's individual comments. It was fairly late in the process, but we have done our very best to address the major issues, and just to reinforce in particular Appendix 3. So the only thing that could cause it to come slightly later is Appendix 3 diagrams every so often become unstable and dance around a bit. So if the Appendix 3 dances, it might be a little later, but I'm hoping that doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. I look forward to it. Just for clarification, normally guidance like this is not subject to ordinary voting procedures. In this instance, we've committed to some due process, and we will take a vote at the board meeting. Only a simple majority is required, but based upon what I heard Monday, assuming we don't get caught up on Appendix 3, we have more than a simple majority, but we will do that in public session for transparency's sake, considering the import of this document and our commitments. So just to give you a heads up on that, so we will vote, and that will occur tomorrow afternoon, my time. Okay, excellent discussion. I know the task force appreciates all your feedback. Tomorrow starts a busy day of EER approval. and then we'll turn straight to 600, which we want to progress. Really appreciate the open spirit by which people are raising issues. So I'll speak to you soon. For those, there is a board get together informally starting in about 10 minutes for those who agreed to do it today. There's also another one tomorrow. But thanks so much. We'll speak to you soon, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.